Hi, and welcome to this masterclass on storytelling. Not just any storytelling, storytelling for your job search and your CV. In it, I'm going to give you a few tips on how to discover your story, understand the power of storytelling, and how to apply it yourself on your CV, your LinkedIn profile, and your interviews. So storytelling, what am I talking about? Novels, fairy tales? How am I going to use this in my job search? How am I going to use this on my CV? I'm Christina Freeman. I'm a CV and LinkedIn profile writer, and that's exactly what I love most about my job, is finding out the story behind every single person that I work with. It's my intention at the end of this masterclass that you'll discover that you too have an interesting story to tell, and hopefully also you'll have the tips and the understanding of how to put it together and use it in your own job search. To do that, I'm going to talk about 4 things. First, the power of storytelling. Second, I want you to find out how to discover your own story. Third, well, how and where do I tell it? And finally, some storytelling guidelines for job searchers. So you'll have your homework to do after the session. So first, the power of storytelling. What you see here in this slide is a master storyteller, Don Draper of Mad Men. He's an advertising executive in the 1960s. And what you see in this scene is his meeting with Kodak, a potential client. Kodak has just come up with a wonderful innovation for that time period, the slide projector. And they're thinking, well, it's in the shape of a wheel. We want Don Draper and his team to come up with something that uses the idea of a wheel. In this meeting, Don Draper delivers a very powerful sales pitch story where he uses his storytelling skills to really sweep them off their feet and close the sale. He says, it's much more than a wheel. This is a carousel. It allows you to travel in time, back and forth. He sees a carousel that allows you to travel nostalgically back and forth in time in response to what he calls that twinge in your heart more powerful than memory alone. He uses the idea of the word nostalgia, the Greek origin of the word, to explain what this carousel is really doing, what this slide projector is really doing. The origin of the Greek word nostalgia is an ache to go home. So suddenly, this thing that was just a wheel, just a slide projector, really cool technology for the time period, it's actually a time machine that allows you to go back and forth and live that nostalgia. So of course, who could resist buying themselves that carousel back in the 1960s? So maybe you're saying to yourself, well, how does he do that? And also, what does it have to do with me? I mean, they're great writers for these series, and he's Don Draper, and he's an advertising executive. That's a really jazzy, sexy profession. I'm just a business analyst, a marketing professional, a web developer, a translator. There's nothing interesting about my job. How can I come up with a story? Well, first I'm going to explain to you how he did it, and then we're going to talk about how you too have a story to tell. What he does is he inserts the product into what it means for people, or what it has the potential to mean for people. Not its features, not that it moves around in this direction and the light comes through and it projects pictures. That's not important to them, right? He's figuring out what it really means, and that's where he comes up with a thread. Okay, but can you do that on your CV? I mean, that's like the least jazzy place to talk about stories, right? And aren't recruiters just looking for keywords and for results? Isn't that what they're really interested in? According to Nobel Prize winner and behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, no one ever makes a decision because of a number. They need a story. So yes, it's true that recruiters are looking for keywords. They're looking for results. You need to optimize your CV. It could go through an ATS, an applicant tracking system. And the recruiter, of course, is looking really quickly, glancing at exactly those keywords. But guess what? A recruiter is hiring a person that works with people, and people that produce products and services for other people. So he's really looking for who is behind the numbers. Because if you just say the numbers, well, there's no story. They exist in a void. They say nothing about you and how you arrived at those numbers. So this is where we can start applying the idea of storytelling. Because just as Kahneman said, we human beings, we need stories. All right, so stories. How do we apply this to a CV? Well, let me tell you about Tom Bruchansky. Tom Bruchansky, he's the director of finance for a large chemical company. And they have under contract what they call a toller in India, a factory that does their manufacturing for them. On his CV, he simply says that he did restructuring of debt and extended a $3 million loan to that factory. But if I start asking him some questions, there's a lot more to the story that he could have said on the CV, and he could have it ready when he thinks about the complete story for an interview. He tells me that he actually traveled to India, and it was during the monsoon seasons, and in that morning when he was going to the factory to meet the factory owner for the first time, he saw and imagined how the 150 factory workers are trudging through potholed and puddled streets to arrive at work in the morning. Little did they know that that day wasn't going to be any old day for them, because that's when he was going to meet with the factory owner, who had an incredible amount of bad debt hovering over him. Of course, from his office in Munich, he imagined somebody completely different than the person that he had in front of him. Shankar told him about the 150 workers and the context of his situation in India and the difficulties he had had. They made a really good connection. And after that experience of meeting him and seeing the factory workers, he realized which of the three choices he had, which of the three proposals he was going to put in front of the board to resolve their problem. And it turns out that by looking more deeply at the problem, he was saving, not just restructuring $3 million of debt, he was saving 150 jobs and $50 million worth of business for his company. When he was done with his meeting, he realized that he had completely different ideas from his office in Munich. And Shankar didn't seem like the type of person who had mounting financial debt and all the troubles that he had. And so he realized what the decision was that he had to make, or the one that he had to put in front of the board and hope to influence them to make that decision. By doing that, he didn't just restructure their debt, $3 million worth of debt. What he finally did, and this is what could go on his CV, is to take a very challenging situation and restructure the debt, yes, but also save 150 jobs and $50 million worth of business. This is what can go on his CV. The rest of the story is really interesting too, and he can use that in an interview, and that makes a really good human connection of traveling to India, understanding what the context was, and through that, making a much better decision for everybody. So wait a second, you're thinking, yeah, of course Tom has a story to tell because he's got a really, high up position in his company, but I'm so junior, I don't do anything that has much impact, so what can I say? What can I talk about? Well, guess again, I bet you do have a very interesting story to tell. The thing is, you never wrote it down. And so this brings me to another quote. This is Tom Clancy, best-selling author, who said, if you don't write it down, it never happened. What does that mean? What did he mean by that? Well, for him as a writer, there's no story if he doesn't write it down, of course. But also for you as a job hunter, networking, whatever it is that you're doing, if you don't write it down, you're not going to remember. It means that you didn't value your own experience, and it doesn't go on your CV. If it doesn't go on your CV, it doesn't go on your LinkedIn profile, and the recruiter will never know. So what we really need to do is write things down. Don Draper has a cool story. Tom Bruchansky has a good story, but you don't have one. That's what Heather thought, Heather Smith. Heather Smith works in quality assurance at a financial institution. She has a very difficult job. She supervises a call center or groups, a team at a call center. What they have to do is call people who are at risk of default on their mortgage payments. So can you imagine what that's like? Calling people up to tell them that they're late on their payments and what could happen if they don't pay? Well, foreclosure, they lose their home. I can't imagine anything more difficult than that. So I tell Heather, well, ask yourself a lot of these questions. Well, what is it that you're doing? Who are you doing it for? And what's the impact of your work? Or what's the result if you don't do your job well? What could happen as a result? But I give her a structure to do that, because what we're doing here is very similar to some of the keys to storytelling. Storytelling could be Tom Clancy writing his novels or somebody coming up with a fairy tale, but it's really the same thing. We're talking about conflict. Some of the three pillars of storytelling, three of them, and there are many, many more depending on where you look and who you ask, but if we want to reduce it for the sake of brevity and say we're talking about conflict, we're talking about characters and resolution. And we can transfer that to our job search and our CV the following way. And this is how you can start writing your own story. So on this slide, you see that there's a chart. And this is how Heather started writing it all down. Challenges, actions, and results. This is very similar to those 3 pillars of storytelling. Challenges are conflict. What's the conflict that you need to resolve? The actions are, well, who are the characters, you being the protagonist, of course. And if you want to get into more storytelling, well, the hero that comes to the rescue, like Tom did, or like Tom Bruchansky or Don Draper. And then the resolution, which are the results. This is just a brainstorm. This is for you to just throw it all down on paper. And this is how Heather did it. She thought, okay, what are my challenges at this job? Well, one of them is the vulnerability of the clients on the verge of default. Another one is my team actually were not reaching targets. Why are we not reaching targets, repayment targets? So she delves into it, and these are her actions. She decides that not all 2 clients are the same. Everyone has a different situation and different reasons why they might not be repaying. So she comes up with tailor-made solutions for their clients on the verge of default. And the result of this is a win-win strategy. That means you can increase repayment to the bank and also have a much better relationship with them and a much better understanding of what's going on. Now, on top of that, it turns out that the institution that she works for is on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, that's a huge conflict. So she has 2 conflicts. There are people on the verge of default, those are their customers, and the institution she works for is on the verge of bankruptcy. So, huge conflict, and her team, of course, is extremely demoralized. So how can she raise their results? How can they reach targets? So she does one-on-one coaching with them to understand their situation and to motivate them to say, well, despite the uncertainty, you don't know if you're going to lose your job, let's go for it. Let's really leave on a good note. If we must leave this job, we're going to leave on a really good note with really good results. And that's what she has here in the last column, the results. Whenever you have numbers, it's best to use the numbers, of course, because they're easy to evaluate. So what she did was raise staff performance from as low as 37% to 90% by doing what? By conducting highly tailored performance evaluations and subsequent coaching. So you see, she started writing it down, and she continued writing it down for all her jobs. And there she had the thread of her story, which had to do with empathy, training, understanding what people needed, and coming up with solutions. Okay, so that's her story, but how does she use it now? How does she transfer this to a CV? The CV, if you think about it, it's a bit of a teaser where there's a bigger story, there's a backstory behind that, but you have to give the recruiter those little pieces, the teaser, the challenge, the action, and the result. So you see in this slide, this is how she decides to present it on her CV, that story. She has a branding statement at the top, which really synthesizes her value, and she has a list of those things that the recruiter is interested in with examples, with concrete examples of that. So this makes for a much more differentiating CV. But guess what? The CV doesn't exist in a void of so many other pieces of your job search. If the recruiter is reading your CV, they're also going to read your LinkedIn profile, and you also have to prepare for an interview. So there's where the backstory, with the rest of it, comes in to really demonstrate and stand out from other candidates in the candidate pool. How does she do that? Okay, so LinkedIn gives you the opportunity to say a lot more. You have more space. It's no longer the teaser. And so she decides to take that opportunity in her About section and to say something like this. Okay, so for her About section, she decides to say a lot more and really bring a lot of herself into it. She starts like this. She says, Bill Gates once said that your most unhappy customers are your greatest sources of learning. And there's no one unhappier or more anxious than someone facing default on a mortgage in the midst of a financial crisis. This is the context in which I developed some of my most valuable talents as a quality assurance analyst, including, and here she lists the different keywords, process and operational efficiency, customer service, training and development, performance evaluations, risk control, account reconciliation, regulatory compliance, and much more. While on my end, I had the uphill battle of recovering payment, I knew that on the other end, our customers were facing loss, a home, a job, sometimes a spouse, and a number of other possible hardships. Here's where training frontline staff and designing and executing best practices for account oversight were key to win-win solutions that maximized repayment and mitigated the adversity they were facing. And here she lists her key accomplishments, and including the last one, establishing a more human approach to repayment. So you see what Heather did? She has a teaser in her CV. in her LinkedIn profile, she brings so much of herself into it, doing exactly what Don Draper did, meaning the product or the service, inserting it into the human experience and how it impacts people. That's how she weaves her story together. So what about you? What's your story? Are you convinced now that you also have a story to tell? If you're not convinced yet, start asking yourself the same questions that Heather asked herself and doing these exercises. Think about the challenge, the conflict, the actions, the characters, and then the resolution of the story, the results, your impact. I'm going to leave you with these 3 guidelines to understand how to use storytelling in your job search. Remember what Tom Clancy said, write everything down. If you don't write it down, it never happened. It's not on your radar and certainly not on the recruiter's radar. Once you write it all down, select your top stories. Which are those stories that you're proudest of, your proudest moments? And especially those that engage with your target audience. You have to tell stories that are interesting to your target audience. Now, with those CAR stories, challenge, action, result, you can expand on them on LinkedIn, just like Heather did. So how do you do that? How did she come to that? We can go back to these key writing tips that a lot of us learned in school. Do you remember? It was the who, the what, the when, where, why, and how. And that's how you're going to spin it together. I can guarantee you that you have a story to tell. If you're not convinced, I know it's because you haven't written it down yet. I hope that through this masterclass you understand how to discover your story and how to use it for your job search. Looking forward to seeing you in the next masterclass.